Good afternoon, everyone. It's 12 o'clock, and as promised, we're going to jump right in. My name is Jill Pulsifer. I am a workplace consultant with the Workers' Compensation Board of Nova Scotia. With me on the call today, I have Chris Spinney, also a workplace consultant. He's going to be presenting with me today on our topic. Supporting us in the shadows, we also have Mr. David Welsh, workplace consultant on our team. We do have everyone's video feed off and mics muted just to make sure that things run without disruption. In saying that, David is going to moderate the chat for us. So as we move through the presentation, if you have questions or comments, thoughts you'd like to share, please feel free to drop them in the chat. If David is able to sort of provide you a quick answer, he's going to go ahead and do that. Otherwise, Chris and I have reserved some time at the end of our content to cover off any questions that you might have. So in our role as workplace consultants, Chris and I work with employers across the province in all industries, supporting them in their injury prevention and return to work programming efforts. One of the things that we run into quite a bit as we start to dig into the processes in an organization are significant opportunities for improvement around training. So because of that, when we were tapped to say, hey, do you want to put together this webinar? We saw a ton of value, pun intended, in covering off training for you today. So most employers do have some, type of safety training or onboarding process that includes some safety information, but typically we find it's very much what we like to call a check the box approach. So we've got a checklist with safety orientation items typically covered off rapidly in the first day or two of hire. It is a large amount of information that we cover off in a short period of time, and it's often not super specific to the actual step-by-step processes or tasks that the worker is going to be assigned. Once we're done going through that checklist, then they get punted, the training gets punted to someone on the operations side of the house who may or may not have a structured hands-on training approach to walk them through and get them onboarded into the organization. So this creates a couple of challenges, right? First of all, we are putting the onus on the trainee to connect the dots between the general safety information and the tasks that they do, right? The other thing is that it tends to not give context to that safety training information and communicate it as critically important at the time that it is critically important, and that needs to be communicated as such. So this is really what we're going to be digging into today, is talking about the marriage or the integration of safety information and the task-specific training and the best practice approach for doing that. So before I pass the mic over to Chris so that you can meet him officially, he waved in the background, but we haven't heard from him otherwise. Just a little bit of a self-reflection question. There's no need to pop your answers in the chat. Feel free to do so if you'd like. But I'd like you to try to get specific and really think about how your current organization onboards and trains people, and in what ways are you currently connecting these general safety principles directly to the hands-on and task-specific learning that you're providing to new hires, if you are in fact making those connections. And then, we'll ask for it at the end of the presentation to come back and see if perhaps you might think about doing it in a different way. So Chris, I'm going to pass the mic over to you to really get us into the content.
Thanks a bunch, Jill. Hey, everyone. Real excited to be here, I guess. But we're going to just jump into this and keep going. I'm sure Jill mentioned already she kind of jammed a bit of too much content. She changed her timings around, so have to be mindful of that. So when Jill and I were discussing the methodology of this webinar, we decided that we wanted to take more of a storybook approach, I guess, to our narrative. And the logical place was to begin at the beginning more than anything here, which in the broad spectrum of training is orientation, so new hire training, whatever your lingo may be. So when new workers begin at your organization or any organization, the kind of $1 million question for everyone is, how do we set them up for success? It begins with that onboarding training that we provide them, right? That's step one here. So what do we hope to accomplish when we do this? Ideally, and this is what, Jill and I, were able to, when we put our heads together here, ideally, we're setting out to equip our employees with the necessary knowledge and skills that will help them perform their jobs both safely and effectively. Now, in terms of knowledge here, this is the theoretical stuff. So just to kind of illustrate an example here, think of being provided, or say, you jump on Google and you find the coolest looking recipe that you can find because you got to bake a cake for your kids, right? This is something that I deal with all the time, it seems like. You've been provided all the pertinent information to be successful, right? Recipe, step-by-step instruction, should be able to pop out a really good cake here. But I guess the big question is, how many of us would actually turn around and actually produce something that actually, tastes good, or that, in my case, that my mother would be proud of? That's kind of my benchmark for everything here. 0% chance is gonna be me. I'm gonna epically flop that cake without a doubt. Just the way it is. So, long story short here, providing information alone is not training. That's kind of, one of your big takeaways from today. Unfortunately, though, this is the bulk of training in many of the organizations that, Jill, myself, the other workplace consultants that we work with see. It's a lot of just take this, read this, walk away, you're good to go, check the box, here we move on. What we know is what we really have to do is match that knowledge with skill development. So in order to truly train our workers, it requires employers to ensure that knowledge is applied correctly. Correctly is a big term there. And that employees actually develop the skills to effectively complete their assigned tasks. Typically, this is achieved through hands-on instruction and, more importantly, monitoring, right? We can show them something, but we got to actually monitor that it actually has some uptake. So we're going to dig into this a whole lot more throughout the webinar. Just to kind of summarize this whole slide in, my nice little illustration example here, to bring it all together, let's go back to my little cake recipe there. Think of it this way. Knowledge is actually memorizing the cake recipe, whereas skill is the ability to actually turn around and bake the delicious cake. So two very different things here. We can, thank you. Jill and I are, really quite aware that a lot of what we're going to speak to today is delving into, our shared experiences with employers, a lot of, peer-to-peer discussion with our colleagues, our other workplace consultants. And just the overall vast assortment of employers that we interact with, day to day, week to week. But really what we wanted to do is we sought out to validate these experiences with some proper data. So we looked at a number of workplace surveys from across the country and found, many similarities in the data here. For our purposes today, we're highlighting this data safety survey that was commissioned by Threads of Life through the Angus Reid Institute. Point out that the survey targeted management level participation. So essentially those responsible for ensuring safety training is, actually in place. So as you can see from this next little visual here, it's showing, what would be the positive representation of the polled organizations for basic health and safety programming or, corresponding training in some of the cases. And essentially to kind of read between the lines here, if you look at, say, the second line there for potential hazard training, 65% are reporting they did offer training in potential hazards. But I guess negative Nelly over here is looking at that and saying, well, that means 35% of organizations polled weren't. We have, over 1,000 respondents here. That's a big chunk of folks that are flat out almost admitting that they just don't offer any training in potential hazards. Or if you even look down at like just basic safety training, third from the bottom there, it had 74% in place. Once again, the critical aspect or critical side of me says, well, that's 26% that didn't offer any safety training at all. Big thing to keep in mind with this is that quality and efficacy of the training weren't part of the evaluation. So just because they said they have it didn't mean it's any good. And we're going to explore that for a little bit, but just try to kind of sit on that for a second, right? It's easy to say we're doing something, or it is easy to do something, but do we really evaluate the quality of what we're doing and kind of those outputs? So that's going to be a big theme today as well. When coaching employers, we often see indicators of ineffective training. Quite often it's inconsistent practices between workers, lack of clarity on overall expectations of what folks are supposed to do, and certainly increased incident rates among whether it's new workers or others. And it often leads to what Jill and I like to call our favorite corrective actions, which is let's just retrain the worker. And frankly, all that normally does is create this cycle of ineffectiveness of blaming the employee. It just continues, right? So we have issues with our training on the front end, and we're just popping them back through it. So sometimes we need to be a little bit more critical there. One thing I'll say, just kind of in closing the slide, is improvement opportunities do come with challenges, and when asked to identify barriers that prevent organizations from improving their health and safety standards, just shy of 50% of all the respondents cited understaffing, cost, lack of time for training as significant training challenges, things that we hear day in and day out pretty consistently in our roles here. So while not exactly surprising to us, because like we say, these are, pretty common things that we hear rather routinely, we did find it interesting in the grand scheme of, overall training that they were, the respondents cited things like cost, time, and staffing levels as these leading challenges to health and safety improvements. So I guess let's just kind of back up a little bit and ask ourselves a bit of a question here. So why do people leave organizations if we're going to look at staff retention right off the get-go? Little reflection, I guess, for any of you who maybe worked somewhere where there were undefined expectations, where team members were potentially completing, work differently. Absolutely no team cohesion, right? We're just kind of, bucking at each other here a little bit. From a overall, performance standpoint, the goalposts are always moving. And peers at the end of the day are just challenging each other on their approaches, right? Let's do it this way, let's do it that way. No, there's no continuity with all these things. I guess the question becomes, is this a psychologically healthy and safe workplace? We know those are, the bulk of the reasons why people actually go out and seek new opportunities and why they move along and cause us those staff retention issues. This definitely decreases operational efficiency, costs both time and money. It also increases costs when errors occur, when incidents take place, or fines, by regulators, kind of in the worst case, might be levied. So really what we're advocating for, the big message today is let's flip that logic and, what will actual effective training do for you? Effective training programs improve business performance and safety performance in tandem, working together. This challenges any of those perceived barriers identified in the studies. This is why we feel your organization will find some value in the approach that we're going to be promoting today in the webinar. So I'm going to hand it back over to Jill here for the next little bit, and she's going to start to walk you through a framework for this slide.
Thanks, Chris. So before we walk through the how-to, or the steps that we're recommending, we wanted to just touch on sort of what are the cornerstones of an effective training program. What does good look like? We've spent a lot of time so far sort of poking at the issues that we see. So let's start talking about what we would like to see instead. So as is the case with any safety management system element, as we are making improvements to our existing program, or if we are building something net new from the ground up, we really advocate taking a plan, do, check, act approach. It's going to promote a methodical method, a very systematic method forward. It's going to generate a clearly defined project plan for you. It's going to build in measures for success, so you know if your efforts are working. And it's rooted in the concept of continually evaluating and improving so that our resources don't get stale and become irrelevant over time. So we want to take this into consideration from day one. So in terms of a plan or the path we're trying to go down, we came up with, we mulled this over pretty significantly. We kind of came up with four buckets when we thought about the training programs that we have seen in practice that just work really well. And first and foremost, and arguably the most important piece, is relevance. So the information that we are providing to our new workers or workers who are being transferred within our organization, whatever the case may be, the information needs to be relevant. And in this context, we mean that we need to be providing the information, and only the information, that is directly applicable to their assigned tasks. We also need to be giving the information in real time when it's needed. So, we talked about, in opening remarks, I talked about this, safety orientation in day 1 or 2, and then we send folks forth into operations. We don't train them on every part of their job on day 1 or 2, depending on the complexity of their role and how frequently we do a task. It might be for 6-8 weeks before we get to a task. And if we've covered off the pertinent safety information 2 months ago, it's not super relevant to what they're doing today, 2 months later. The training or the information needs to be rooted in risk awareness. And we're going to dive into that in great detail here in just a little bit. So I'm going to move past that. But that's the first piece, is really setting out to make sure that the information we are providing is incredibly relevant. We also need to make sure that the training process and tools guarantee that the process is repeatable. So regardless of who is training, who is providing the training, we should have a high degree of confidence that every trainee is receiving the same quality of information in a similar way based on their individual needs, of course. So I don't know about you, but this is a conversation I've heard, many times out in the field with employers. Someone will make an offhanded remark and we say, oh, well, I know that I can tell that Dave trained Chris, because look at the way that Chris is, performing this task. That's 100% Dave's technique. If you're hearing that, that should be like a flag. That should cause you to take pause, because that means we've got trainers out there training on their own, preferred way of doing things, which means it's not repeatable. Because then if Jane is training Sally, Sally is learning Jane's approach, and no one is getting, people aren't getting the same standardized training. We also need to make sure that the training is verifiable. So we need to confirm that the training we provided was effective. It's not enough to give someone, a suite of information and say, read this and sign here. So that, we can check the box, and, if the bad thing happens, I can say, see, I showed them, or I gave them this information. If for training to be effective, we need to not only be able to ascertain that, yes, we gave them the information, but we need to also confirm that it was understood and it's being applied, that the practice reflects the processes we've defined, which brings us to that last piece. If we're defining the processes, those processes need to reflect what we're actually doing in our operation. Every organization, I don't really care what industry you're in, we're constantly changing, and with technology, sometimes we change a little faster than most of us can keep up with. So we need to have some sort of mechanism inside of our training process and program guidance that will not only require routine review to ensure that the information that we're sharing and standardizing our expectations to is reflective of current practices, but also some sort of trigger that as we're moving through time, if there is a measurable change in the way that we're doing work, that there's a trigger, that we're going back and we're evaluating that. Otherwise, we're doing what, Chris and I and David would run into, fairly often is, hey, like, do you have a procedure for this? Or, what's your process for that? And they're like, yeah, we do, but we got a new machine 2 years ago. So like, yeah, that doesn't really apply anymore. And I'm like, okay. So we went through the pains of making this tool or setting a standard, and then we just let it fall by the wayside. So we're going to carry this plan, do, check, act sort of motif throughout the remainder of our discussion today. And so I'm going to dive us into the planning piece. If you forget everything I'm about to say, please develop a plan, if we can remember that. The big message here is we don't just say, oh, we need to fix our training and just start randomly building pieces. To be really frank, that's how most existing training programs that I've personally evaluated came to be in the first place, right? John put together a little handbook. Then there was an incident 2 years later. So we said, oh, we should probably train people on this new way of doing it. It's piecemeal. It's just been lumped together, oftentimes really reactively. So there's like a ton of gaps and it's just not well thought out. So we need to develop a plan. I'm not going to go through a whole change management 101 crash course for you, but whether you are revamping your existing program or you are, considering building one from the ground up, step one, really sit down and figure out, what are your goals and how are you going to achieve them, or what are your objectives, right? And don't do this in a silo. Like, I'm not sure what everyone's role is on this call, but, like, let's say we have someone who's the HR/safety manager for an organization. And so they're like, yeah, I'm going to update. I'm working on the training stuff because I'm working on the onboarding process from the HR lens. So I might as well do some safety training stuff on the other side. Don't do this in a silo. We want to involve all interested parties. We've already flagged for you a big contributor to issues and ineffectiveness in existing training programs for folks is that there is this clear division between the safety information and the operational training component. So we need to involve folks from operations, and I suggest involving them, at the goal setting stage. So what are they not getting out of the current training process? What would they benefit from getting? Whether that is your frontline supervisors, it is the trainers themselves, perhaps people, frontline workers who've been recently trained, worker reps from the committee, what have you. Choose your own adventure in that respect. But the other piece too is really important to connect with your senior leadership team on this and see if there's opportunity to align, the objectives and goals in this, training improvement project with the broader organizational objectives and strategic planning, right? And, as Chris said, there's often an opportunity to improve not only safety performance, but business performance as well. So we can, so to speak, kill two birds with one stone here, but we need to bring the right people to the table at the right time and start those conversations early on to get us off in the right direction. Finally, last, most certainly not least, because we are going down this rabbit hole firmly, we need to be really systematic in assessing our training needs. Because we don't want to build our program out in bits and pieces, we do need some sort of framework or methodology to allow us to systematically assess who needs to be trained on what and when and using what modality. If we aren't systematic in our approach, it's in all likelihood, we're not going to be successful in providing all of the necessary and relevant information that's needed. And we may miss the opportunity to end up developing those important skills that Chris talked about. So how do we do that? Internal responsibility system. So the IRS is the foundation of the Occupational Health and Safety Act in Nova Scotia. So, I mean, when we think about it, it is the foundation of our legislation, and the key principles of the IRS should be integrated into all of our safety practices. So I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole too deep. I'm going to hone in on one little element of it, as David Welsh, our moderator today, did deliver a really fantastic webinar in April on the IRS and due diligence. And so he's going to pop the link to the recording for that webinar in the chat if that's something you would like to dive into a little bit deeper. What we're going to talk about today is the one element, one of the workers' rights, which is the right to know. And so the Act requires employers to provide workers with information that affect their health and safety. So if we think about that, we typically, employers, you say, how do you satisfy the right to know? And they say, oh, well, through training or procedures or other administrative controls. So if that's how we're satisfying most times this right to know in our operation, it makes perfect sense that we would use meeting this requirement as sort of the framework or the foundation for our assessment tool. So really, if we break down what information a worker might need to know that could impact their health and safety in the workplace, really boils down, in our opinion, to three categories. We need to communicate what is hazardous to them, why it is hazardous, or what risks does working around this hazard present to the worker, what could happen. And then finally, and arguably most importantly, we need to then explain to them what steps they must take to prevent injury or illnesses, or to mitigate the risk of exposure to the hazard. So, if we think back, really, we got to kind of go a little bit further, though. We've got to go a little bit further down the rabbit hole, because if we just go through a job and create a laundry list of hazards, risks, and controls, we're still not creating really great relevance for the worker, right? We're not contextualizing the information. So we need to figure this out. We need to flush out this comprehensive list of information related to safety that we must provide to the worker, but we really ought to be integrating it, that information, in a meaningful way into the step-by-step process instructions. And so we recommend, using the safe work procedure or similar, whatever you want to label it as. So we're going to talk about exactly what we mean by a safe work procedure and sort of how to get to that place in the coming slides. But for now, I'm going to pass it over to you, Chris, to take us down that path.
Jill, really to just echo what, Jill was mentioning here, just, as we transition over to here, the best way of ensuring that we're satisfying that right to know when training our employees on tasks that are new to them is through a safe work procedure. We're not, reinventing the wheel here in terms of anything safety related. For the most part, I would say through the number of attendees here today, it's probably, familiar nomenclature here coming out. So really what we're after here, without having some sort of written instruction on how to properly, and I guess more importantly, safely complete a task, this is where, back to what I was saying earlier, we end up with that inconsistent transfer of information or knowledge. We end up with large gaps in the delivery of that important information, and therefore, really at the end of the day, just inconsistent and unsafe practices among workers. Like I mentioned, in terms of this being a familiar term, I will say this: many or even most employers do have some form of written instruction for tasks, at least for some or even most of their tasks. But really, in our experience, we see a lot of common gaps here. Within those instructions, or in those written instructions, they're not actually laid out in a step-by-step instruction, or they're missing key steps, or they may not reflect current practices. Oftentimes, they're outdated procedures, practices, new equipment's been implemented, things have changed. And we're now using old information to do new tasks, and we end up with these issues. More times than not, they fail to actually define the important hazard. Like, just call the darn thing out. What am I trying to avoid here, right? Or keep myself safe from? And then they really do not explain what the potential impact of that hazard could be. So how is this potentially going to cause the person harm, right? So again, back to what we're saying, it's just a matter of spelling this out for folks. Finally, and kind of again, some of the key, takeaways we want from today, there's no standardization in that training approach between trainers, and over time, it doesn't allow it to be, to what Jill mentioned earlier, repeatable or verifiable, and frankly, just causes confusion to your staff, right? So I guess let's just, once again, little mini self-reflection pause here. If you do have safe work procedures, do they actually kind of hit those criteria that I mentioned above? Something to kind of think about there. I will say, perhaps you are like many of the organizations we have. So like I said, a lot of folks do have this, instructions or even step-by-step instructions, but they tend to be in one document we'll say over here. But that important or critical safety information regarding hazards, controls, whatever, it's living in another resource. So we got step-by-step instruction here, critical safety information over here. And really at the end of the day, we're expecting our employee to kind of make the link and bridge the gap between these two things. So think of, say, a simple example of, manual material handling here. So staff will complete this training as, say, a prerequisite to ensure, good handling processes or practices, good, safe, sound body postures while doing tasks. Now we incorporate them or start to train them on an actual specific task that requires, maybe, lifting or carrying some element from point A to point B. But we're telling them, okay, so you pick up box, you follow manual materials handling training, and bring it over there. So we're expecting them to kind of bridge that on their own. And I guess really what we're advocating for is, how do we integrate this much better? So how do we make sure that our safe work procedures clearly identify and describe all those hazard controls, and more than anything, truly explain their importance and make it meaningful to folks? So how do we actually get to the state where we're actually developing what we would deem the effective safe work practice? Not just a safe work practice to check the box and say we got the thing, but actually you get to the effective, really handy, useful one. Really what we're looking at here is, to what Jill alluded to earlier too, is some form of job hazard assessment, or even more specifically, a task hazard assessment as we narrow our focus. This is the tool that can help us develop these safe work procedures. So through these, you will, as you can see on the slide here, systematically actually break down a task within a job to identify any possible hazard, explain how they could cause harm, and oftentimes we would actually assign some form of risk ranking to provide some type of objective and comparable measure. So we can kind of know just how bad it is or how much risk is actually on myself. Once we actually know all the hazards, we can then take inventory of the controls we have in place. So whether it's our PPE, our processes, tools, equipment, whatever we might have in place already to help mitigate those hazards. Because we actually took the time, hopefully, and created some type of objective or comparable measure, this allows us to actually look at, are the controls that we have in place effective? Are they doing what they should be doing, which is reducing the potential harm of our hazards? Oftentimes we put lots of controls in place, but we don't actually retrospectively look back at them and say, are they doing what they're supposed to be doing? Are they limiting risk? We work for WCB. We see injuries all the time coming in, really good, adequate controls in place, but there's a gap. There's a missing link in there. Finally, these all boil up to just really at the end of the day, clearly identifying what we need our employees to know to stay safe And then at the end of the day, that's what we train them on, right? So it's this back to the systematic approach to it. It's gathering the info, doing our homework, our pre-work to actually have the content to be able to pull it up. So I will say this, super duper short 2-minute crash course general overview of hazard assessments here. We're not digging into hazard assessments. That's not really the takeaway here. So what we want to do, similar to what Jill mentioned around the IRS, we want to just point you to a place if you're really interested or if you still have a gap in learning here. Really what we want to do here is just provide you a couple resources that you guys can go to. So Dave's going to pop a couple things in the chat here too for links. These ones here that we identified are through the Department of Labor, Skills Immigration. So Safety Branch essentially sponsors some OH&S courses through, as you can see, CCOHS. You may have heard of them. In short, Nova Scotians can take up to 8 free courses every year. So you can definitely go into there. We kind of vetted that one specifically as a free resource. Jill and I both were in agreement. It gives you kind of the nuts and bolts background information that would be essential. The one you're looking for in particular is hazard and risk, identify, assess, control, and evaluate. Don't get me wrong, you can't link straight through it, so it's a little bit clunky. A few extra clicks we'll actually provide you some resource to help point you and get you through that navigation here. Before I hand it back to Jill here, we're going to walk through some examples. We do have a suite of handouts that I just alluded to that we're going to hand over to you at the end of this, and they'll serve as samples for you. And really, we're going to demonstrate how we move from hazard assessment to safe work procedure and use those tools to create that systematic, focused, comprehensive training protocol for any given role here. So
awesome. Thank you, Chris. I'll get the slide to move forward here. So yeah, we've spent a lot of time, to use Chris's analogy, talking about this recipe, right? The recipe for success. And because Chris, you don't want to eat his cake, I'm going to be the one to kick us off and kind of show you how to get it into the oven and onto someone's plate. So really, really quick. I know we kind of talked about this hazard assessment, but there's some pieces here I'm going to just sort of touch on. So we talked about being systematic and having a plan. So step 1 in hazard assessments is we make this like list of jobs, right? So now we're identifying, okay, what training needs are we going to need to consider? Then for each job, we're going to dial it down to sort of like the big buckets of tasks. So if we have a baker, for example, what tasks are we assigning them? Then we are going to take and do a dive on that. We're going to go out and we're going to observe the baker baking the cake or whatever the task is, and make our inventory of hazards, the risks, and listing out all of the controls that we have, which is going to serve as a checklist for our procedure. What safety information, in addition to the step-by-step instructions, are we going to need to put in there? And this will allow us to develop a risk-informed procedure for each task. So then when we think about it, if we go back to, you may have a baker, you may have a line cook, you may have a cashier, whatever. For each of these jobs, we take those procedures and put them together. And this essentially serves as our training manual. Right. So if we think back to the 4 characteristics of an effective training program, we talked about the importance of relevant information. Well, this is going to be, it doesn't get more relevant than this, and it's going to be risk informed because we've done that. It's going to be repeatable because regardless of what trainer is training what trainee, they're going to be training according to the processes defined in this sort of this playbook. It's going to be verifiable because now we have a very clearly defined process with very clear expectations that at any point in time, we can go out into the operational area or the production area and look at the written procedure, observe what the person's doing, and like, are they following process? And, through data, is it keeping them safe? Is it working? And the bonus point, and sorry, Chris, I'm totally going off script. We didn't rehearse this part. The bonus point here is that as part of this process, you're observing the task. And so we've talked a couple of times, mentioned a couple of times about how oftentimes procedures don't reflect current practices. Well, like, you're going to be out there collecting this information by watching someone do the thing, right? So we know that at least at the point of inception, it's current. We're not just sitting in our office saying, all right, what steps would be involved in baking a cake? We are going out and we are watching it in action. So it's going to hit all of those four things. So let me show you what it looks like. So on your screen here, this is, Chris had mentioned like risk rating. We took out like any sort of numbers or ratings just for simplicity's sake. But we're going to imagine right now that we have a task. We're really zoomed in on something just for demonstration purposes. Folks, you wouldn't necessarily go through this process for something as minute as diluting a floor cleaner. This would be part of a bigger task, but just for demo purposes. In this case, we've got this imaginary chemical, floor cleaner plus. That is the hazard. It presents two risks to the worker. In our imaginary scenario, chemical burns to the skin or and eye injury. And then we've listed some specific controls for each of the risks, as well as some shared administrative controls. So things like gloves, goggles, dress code, emergency response equipment, and then general information and some prerequisite training. Okay, so there's the information. And now when I advance to the next screen, and pre-warning, it's a really busy slide, and I really don't like this many words on a slide, but we did feel it was really important for us to go through this process in detail as an example. What you're going to see is that every single piece of information that's listed here is going to make an appearance in chronological order where it makes sense in the sample procedure. So on the left-hand side, you don't necessarily need to list it all out like this. This is just for a visual purpose, kind of repeating those pieces of information from our hazard assessment. And then you can see here, the hazard is clearly stated. We're not just saying put on safety glasses and gloves. We're actually spelling it out and saying using this product is putting you at risk of this type of injury. And so in order to prevent that from happening, you must. So I'm going off script again, Chris. We talked about retraining the worker. That really is triggering. It's to me a form of passing the buck and putting the blame on the worker's shoulders. The other thing I hear a lot, particularly in safety committee meetings, when they're reviewing an incident, they say, there's no common sense anymore, or it's not common knowledge. And like really makes my eye twitch, because no, the right to know doesn't say, folks, you have the right, doesn't, necessitate that the employer only communicate safety information that they personally feel a worker wouldn't otherwise know. Right? There's no disclaimer, or there's no caveat there for exceptions. We need to be explicit. We need to be clear. We need to realize that, hey, we could have a brand new worker who's 18 years old and 17-year teenager. They may have never mixed a chemical in their life. They may have never read a chemical label in their life. We don't presume to know what they do or don't know. So take that out. There's no, if that ever comes up, well, it's just common sense. That should be a flag to you. It's not. Are we missing something? Are we missing information? So we're very explicit, and I'm not gonna, again, like as Chris said, we've got examples to send out to you. But we're being really, really explicit here. Another little sidebar call out. You'll notice here that WMIS, this really kind of supports our overarching point. We put a prerequisite in here. Hey, like before you do this task, you should have done WMIS. Now, I see it all the time that employers incorrectly believe that WMIS is chemical training. It is not. Right? WMIS is just hazard communication training. It just teaches folks how to read chemical safety information by way of labeling requirements and safety data sheets and symbols and such. We still need to contextualize that information within the location specific or our organization's processes. And then we also need to call out the specific safety precautions. We're not going to assume that they went to the safety data sheet and that they understood everything that's on there. There's a lot of information on there. So yeah, we want them to be familiar with it, but we're going to call out the safety critical information. So I hope that this makes sense. I know it seems like a lot of information, but it's like, you know, maybe you're adding, I don't know, 150 words to your procedure, right? And it's just going to make them so much more effective. It's also going to explain the why to folks, right? So we're not asking them to connect the dots. I don't know. My mother used to do this when I was younger. You know, she would tell you to do something. It didn't make sense. And I'd say, well, why? And she'd say, because I told you so. I mean, as a teenager, telling on myself here, that made me just want to defy her directives even more, right? But if she were to say, oh, well, we need to do this because of, I'm like, oh, okay, that makes sense. And I'm much more likely to comply and go along with it, right? Because I understand the importance of what it is that she's asking.
Thanks, Jill.
So you're good, Chris?
Yeah. So with this level of detail, I hope it's appreciated that at the end of the day, this is more than a one-day safety orientation. This isn't pretty much, you know, what we're advocating for here is just group this all into day one, all even more information and kind of close our eyes and hope for success here. It's very much the living, breathing process. And as some resources we're sharing will demonstrate, this could take, you know, many days. It could take weeks. It might take a month. It might take even more, depending on as new workers are, you know, potentially assigned additional tasks or those less common tasks just, you know, all of a sudden present themselves. You know, think of seasonal differences or, you know, changes that take place. We would, you know, compound and add that additional training. Also, keep in mind, you know, this would apply for internal transfers as well. Can't make any assumptions that just because someone is working for, say, employer X and they interact with, you know, job Y all the time, that if they move over to job Y, they just know the stuff, right? Or understand everything that exists within that various role. So we want to be mindful of that as well. So I guess the question is, how does this look in true practice, right? To reiterate, reading a safe work practice alone doesn't qualify as training, and very well might just be step one, right? So again, if we're kind of in that mentality of here's the policy manual or here's the safe work practices, hand it over to the employee and, you know, happy reading, you know, that might just be, like we said, step one here. So what we're advocating for truly is that consistent and, you know, rather holistic training approach. So as you can see right here on the board, step one, training reviews safe work procedures in some way or form, right? It could be reading, it might be through watching a video, you know, whatever it may be. They're just going to do that cursory review and kind of reflective, you know, kind of self-learning piece first. Step two in this, to kind of layer on and add a little bit more, is the actual trainer, whomever it is, would actually demonstrate the process, right? Don't just throw folks out to the wolves right off the get-go. Let's actually show them how they should do it, and really emphasizing here that their approach should focus in, really harness in on that safety critical information, right? If the person training me is focused on it, well, then that's just gonna bode well that I'm gonna carry that forward. Once that demonstration's taken place, then we kind of move down to the third step, which is the trainee actually just attempts it, but with support, right? So again, this is back to I'm now observing, participating with them perhaps. It depends on the complexity of the task, of course, right? But this is really the opportunity for that direct coaching or, you know, in some cases, just troubleshooting piece, right? Big thing to look at here is we want to focus on developing an understanding and not memorization here. So don't just go out there and say, you need to use this specific motion, very much what Jill, you know, spoke about, but we want to tell them why that's the case. So, for example, maybe in the past we used to install a part a certain way, but they were seeing lots of, say, wrist injuries because of that. So now we always want to, position our hand in a different way, that might be deemed the more safer way that will help reduce that risk. And really what you've done is you've embedded purpose into the whole thing, right? Back to, Jill's point, why we're doing it, which really is the glue that's going to hold this all together. At the end of the day, we might have to repeat some or maybe even all of the steps back to the complexity of the task, maybe the education level of the trainee. It could be just as simple as we have tons of newcomers in the province here. It might just be a language barrier thing that we really need to just kind of, reiterate on a different level a few more times. Really, all we want to get to is a point where that trainee can reliably complete and has demonstrated the actual understanding and application of knowledge in this case. And that's really what competency is, big takeaway for the day. This is about building folks into demonstrated competency here. Their practice matches the process, and we've really, at the end of the day, established some expectations here. By consistently applying knowledge in a real way, you will develop their skills. One thing to take away from this is be mindful of your trainers. This is vitally important, and we need to ensure that we're actually training them effectively, so that they're actually following the same process. If we got trainer to, I think we said it on like slide 2 or 3 here. If Dave's going out and training me one way and Sally, I can't remember the other person Jill alluded to, is training someone else a different way, and you can completely see our different practices, the whole program kind of implodes on itself here. So something to really be mindful of is that consistency within our trainer. So the one thing I will say, determining your competency here at the end in a given task is not the end of the process that we're advocating for here. Your effective training program, will not only determine competency, but will ensure that, those common practices are reflective of the written protocols we have on the day of training, but then every single day after that. And really is how we make everything in this case just nice and sticky. So yeah, go ahead, Jill. So the big question here, and mindful that, we're in our last 10 minutes here, so I'll try to bring this one together here, is, how do we do this not just once, but each and every time over time? And I'm a massive advocate for writing the thing down, right? We need to create the playbook, right? If we don't write it down, it just kind of poofs off into, the Netherlands here, not Netherlands, but the netherworld, whatever. Big thing we see here all the time is when key personnel that oversee the process leaves, it just leaves with them, and we have to start from scratch. No one can argue how inefficient that is. That's going to cost us a lot of money, right? We're just restarting the wheel here. So we want to build tools that will keep us on track. Once again, you're going to see some training checklists that we're including in our resource guide at the end of this. The idea is it's put in there to be very organized in a nice, easy way. Big thing is training needs to be stepwise. So we need to be appreciative of that. So it's pertinent that some training needs to come before others. It'd be kind of crazy to train someone on a task that's complete in a confined space before we actually give them, baseline confined space training, just for a simple illustration. So again, recognizing it needs to be organized and formally tracked here. We certainly don't want to forget about our supportive roles that help execute these functions. I talked about the trainers before, but think about our management team, our occupational and safety committee. They need training as well to be successful in this stuff. Most important, they need to be competent already and understand that critical safety information for the tasks that they actually directly oversee. Otherwise, how can they properly support their workers? Might be things around leadership skills, whether it's challenging conversations or just supporting or recognizing the good work workers might do. We can look at like incident investigation and actually getting, in-depth root cause analysis training so that they can actually go out and, if there has been an incident, they understand how to do hazard evaluation and control that could be there. It might be as simple as just, WCB here speaking, return to work, right? So setting expectations, understanding expectations, supporting workers in staying at work or transitioning workers back to work and ensuring we're bringing them back to safe environments free of hazards that might have led to the injury in the first place here. The final kind of, last little piece that I'll leave you guys with here is the commitment on the leadership side of things, right? So we really want them focusing on some form of leading indicator. Don't just be responsive and reactive to everything taking place. So how can we actually get folks and demonstrate, for example, through defined and, some defined or consistent commitment that will get our supervisors out to observe work being done, against what's written down. So we're actually practically doing this stuff, how they can support workers that might need additional support. Or like we said, my kind of favorite thing is how can we recognize workers for specific task behaviors? And what I mean by that is we're not just focused on end outcomes. We love to look at the end of the day and say, hey, Jill accomplished X, Y, and Z, pat on the back, we're puffing her up, making her feel really good about herself, but she took 10 shortcuts all day and cheated a whole bunch of times. And so we don't want to reinforce that kind of behavior. Finally here, just for a bit of reflection as I leave you, have any of you, ever been a worker or worked somewhere where what you've been trained on doesn't match what the workplace's quote unquote reality is, right? So let's actually just kind of, step back and think of how crazy that actually sounds from a business place, right? I get trained on this, but then I go out onto the floor and it's like completely different. No, this is how we do it here. That's the definition of truly checkbox safety. It's absolutely pointless, inefficient, and just erodes all our relationships that we might have. So if you as an organization say you value something or you demonstrate it through training or something, it's only meaningful if you actually demonstrate it on the back end. So I'm going to pass it back over to Jill. She's going to bring us to close here in the last couple of minutes. So thanks, guys.
Really just going to kind of wrap this up with a couple of really quick final thoughts. So bringing us back to this initial model, Chris was talking about this idea of, verification and monitoring, right? But zooming out a little bit bigger picture on this check is go back to your original plan as you go on this journey. And I really hope you guys, choose to in the coming months to start digging into some of this. We've seen just really tremendous success with this approach with the employers that we've supported in the past. But measure it. Did you meet the goals that you set? Talk to your people. Please go talk to your people. Check in with the trainers and the trainees. Did it work? Maybe you run a pilot. You do this just for one part of one role and you want to see, all right, does this approach actually work? Jill and Chris said it's awesome, but not fully trusting. It's a bit of work. Go try it. I encourage you to, and then see how it goes. Again, monitor, give your leaders, your frontline leaders, the skills and the clear expectations for them and their roles that it is up to them to be monitoring compliance with your safety practices. But now they're going to have a playbook, right? Now there's going to be firm training. There's something for them to lean back on in those conversations. Measure success through performance. So is this leading to improved worker retention? Is it leading to reduced injury rates and so on and so forth? And once you get that information, please do something with it and then take action on that information. Communicate the successes, right? So, you set your goals and objectives. We should be communicating that on the front end with our workforce, and then fill them in on how it went. What went well? What didn't go so well? What are our plans for the future? Say we're going to, conduct our next review or our next round of revisions on such and such a date, pushing us through that continuous improvement model. So on the very last slide, this is just a summary of everything that we've talked about today in one shot. And, no need to sort of memorize that. We've included that in the handout along with the other resources that Chris has mentioned. So we have a couple minutes left. I don't have a hard stop. So if you have some burning questions, please stick around and we can chat about it. But I do thank you all for your information or for your attention, sorry. And we will kind of reach out to Dave and see if anything came up in the chat and if there's anything you guys wanted to raise at this point.